So we've been getting a lot of questions about HOAs right here in Florida, and we want to make sure that you're armed with all the information that you need before you purchase in an HOA. Let's chat about it. Welcome to Life on the Emerald Coast. This is Andrew with the Emerald Group here at eXp Realty. And on this channel, we do all things about living on the Emerald Coast, from Pensacola to Panama City Beach and everything in between. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap that little bell so that you'll be notified every single time we do a new video. Now, before we get into the good stuff, people have been reaching out to us asking, hey, can you help us purchase? Can you help us move out there? Yes, that's absolutely what we can do. All of my information is in the screen, so go ahead and call, send a text, email, carrier pigeon, smoke signal, paper airplane, whatever you want to do to get a hold of us, and we will definitely help you when it comes to moving here to the Panhandle. So buying in an HOA here in Florida, whether it's in the Panhandle or Southern Florida, it doesn't matter where in Florida, there are definitely some things you need to know, and this area is no different. So as you're doing your research for a condo complex or a home neighborhood, I'm just going to call it an HOA community in general for the remainder of the video, and that's kind of all-encompassing. Keep in mind that HOAs can be just about any type of property you can think of. So when buying in an HOA community, the first big thing that you should figure out is what are the rules and regulations. So the rules and regulations, the CC&Rs, the frequently asked questions, really anything to pertain with the condo, you need to scour through to make sure they're going to match with what you want. Some condo complexes here in our area don't allow pets. Some do. Some have a 20-pound restriction. Some have a 50-pound restriction. Some will allow just about any pet. In fact, some even allow, I just saw one today that allows birds and fish, but no dogs or cats, just birds and fish, which is kind of a unique one. But the entire point is you want to make sure that you can use the property for your intended use. Now, when it comes to buying a property inside of an HOA community, you are given a right of rescission period here in this state. That is 3 days after you receive all docs. You are allowed to walk away for any reason. It's called the right of rescission period, okay? So make sure that you're utilizing that to use those that 3 day period to go through everything you need. You don't get those docs right away. Jump down your agent's throat. They need to be getting you those docs. If they're not getting them, the other agent needs to get you them. But one way or another, those need to be in your hands before you buy in an HOA community, particularly on condos here. When I say a 3 day right of rescission, I think technically that counts to condos here in our state. I don't technically think that counts for all HOA neighborhoods. I was kind of in condo mode when I was talking, but the entire point is make sure you're getting that, whether it's a condo complex or not. The next tip I have for you before buying in an HOA community is research the pay, the fees, all inclusive, all the fees, every fee you can think of, not just HOA fees. A lot of people look at HOA fees and that's the end all be all. It's not necessarily the end all be all. Some put other fees behind it that are not part of the HOA. I personally believe it's kind of a scammy feel sort of way, the way they do it, that it's not part of the HOA, but it's mandatory for you to pay. But there's a lot of complexes that do this. We just had one listed not too long ago that's exactly what they did. They had this list of HOA things that you had to pay for that equated to like $535 a month. And then on top of that, they had, you also have to pay the cable bill, which is $60 a quarter, and you have to pay this, which is $65 a quarter. And there was 3 or 4 different fees. One of them was even a fee to use the gym that you had to pay regardless, which to me should be an HOA fee. But in whatever reason, whatever the reasoning is, they decided to put that as a separate expense instead of underneath the HOA fees. These are all things underneath that umbrella of stuff that you need to look into before purchasing in an HOA. And this isn't just condo complexes. This is all HOA communities, including single-family home gated communities and things like that. Now, the third tip I have for you is actually the most underutilized tip that we have, and that is checking into the finances of the HOA. This is something that most full-time condo or HOA community agents will do if that's what their specialty is, or if they do a lot of business in that realm in general. It's one thing that we do. We always check into the finances and kind of give our thoughts on what the reserves look like and how much do they have, how much are they asking, what's coming up, how old is the roof, how old is the structure, are they going to have to reface the building, do they have any foundation issues that we know of, are they accounting for this stuff, do they have all of those in reserve so that there's no surprises when the roof needs to be replaced because it's 30 years old, right? So just keep all of these things in mind. This is a big question you need to ask and not one that is generally just presented to you. Now, with that being said, make sure that you're talking to your real estate professional. They're going to know whether or not they can release this information to you. Not every HOA complex has this stuff published publicly, and not all of them release it to their owners. So sometimes you can't get a hold of this stuff. There's just not really a way to do it. You can ask the property manager, you can ask the condo association manager, HOA manager, but if it's a private thing, they keep all of their finances private, then there's not much you can do. Luckily, here in our area, most of the condos and most of the HOA complexes have all of their finances open and available for everybody. If it's a small community where it's like $50 a year, something like that, you're probably not going to need to get into their finances because they're probably not providing enough for that to matter. But this is a really big deal when it comes to condos in particular. The fourth tip I have for you when buying in an HOA community is to talk to people in the community. Not just when you're walking around the neighborhood or walking around the condo, but also speak to the CAM or the HOA manager, speak to the maintenance guy if you can, speak to anybody that you can to kind of get a feel for the neighborhood, if it is that important to you. Now, if you're just like, hey, I bought an HOA neighborhood, I like the rules and regulations, it's good enough for me, cool. This tip is pointless then. But if you're one that you really want to make sure that you're getting inside of a community that you prefer, then definitely go around and talk to the players. The next tip I have for you is to get involved in the HOA itself. So a lot of people don't do this, and it blows my mind. If you're going to live in a place that are going to dictate rules and regulations on you, I think that you should have some sort of idea of what's coming up next. Now, I'm not saying that you need to go become the president and become that rock star condo association manager that you know you are deep inside, but you should get involved to at least vote and know what's coming up. This way, if you ever have to sell the property, you know exactly what's coming up without doing a bunch of work, and that you'll have a good forecast on what's coming through the pipeline so that you know how that's going to affect your second home or investment or primary home, if that's what you're buying it for. Your next tip when buying in an HOA community is that HOA fees can vary and they can change on a moment's notice. This goes back to what I was saying just a moment ago about getting involved so that you know this stuff is coming up. The fees can vary. It could be $250 a month, 1 month, and they could go, hey, just found out we've got a structural defect, or we've got something that we've got to do to the pylons, particularly here in Florida, since we just had a condo like a year ago collapse somewhere, which is like the craziest thing, right? Like they build these things very well. But when that happened, a whole spree of changes happened all across Florida because everybody started freaking out. And they were like, we want to make sure all of our people are safe, and we want to make sure nobody's yelling and complaining at us because they see a little crack in something, even though that crack's just fine. So a lot of changes started happening, which means some of the fees went up because the condo complexes needed to pay for some of these. Most condo complexes or HOA communities will keep a reserve. Actually, almost all of them keep a reserve. They should, but they generally keep a pretty sizable reserve so that when this stuff comes up, they don't have to affect the lives of their members. But that's not always the case. Sometimes unexpected things come up. We have hurricanes here. Sometimes a hurricane will come through and just demolish a building, rip a roof off, and something's got to get done. And it was a 2-year-old roof or 5-year-old roof, and insurance is only going to cover a portion of it. And then so the owners need to cover the rest. Like, there's just so many things that could happen, but just note that the HOA fees can vary. This next tip is kind of a smaller one, but when purchasing in an HOA community, typically your closing costs are going to be higher. Now, there's so many factors that go into closing costs, it's ridiculous. And a lot of times if you're buying, let's say, a condo complex, sometimes your closing costs are actually cheaper, even though you're paying for the HOA maybe a year in advance or for the month of, or any assessments or what have you. A lot of times they're cheaper because your insurance is cheaper, because you might only need an HO6 or an HO3 policy, which is kind of like, HO3 is kind of like a rental insurance just for your contents inside. So sometimes it's cheaper then, but most of the time you're having to pay for that, so your closing costs are going to go up a little bit. It's not generally that much. You'll generally have maybe a new buyer fee, which is kind of rare. I would say they're probably on about 20% of condos and HOA homes out here, and that's generally like 0.5% of the purchase price, or maybe $100, or maybe it's a filing fee of $150, something like that, and then your first months of HOA. Or if it's quarterly or paid out yearly, sometimes they'll have you pay everything up front, and then you'll pay the estoppel fee. All in all, this generally doesn't make that big of a difference to adjust your purchasing power or anything like that. It's generally less than $1,000 in almost every case, until you start getting into some of the really high-end ones where the HOA is $2,000 a month. Obviously, that's going to affect it a little more. When you're buying a $3 million condo, another $2,000 doesn't really compute in the grand scheme of things for most people. But at the end of the day, this is just something to keep an eye on. It is a little bit extra in closing costs most of the time. All right, your next tip is to note that in your HOA, some of your amenities can be down, but you still might be paying for it. So, prime example, in the winter here, us Floridians do not handle the cold very well. So we even shut down some of our heated pools, believe it or not. Heated pools, we shut them down because we're like, they're not going to go out there. It's not going to get used. So they'll sometimes take the water out. Sometimes they'll leave the water in and just put things up saying it's not in service or what have you. And they'll try to save a little bit of money on the maintenance and upkeep of that during the down months. The same thing could happen with your gym, with your sauna, your hot tub, whatever you've got in your complex. Some of the amenities might be down and you're still probably going to have to pay for them. In fact, a lot of times if they're down for something that isn't scheduled maintenance like winterizing or anything like that, then generally your HOA might even go up if the reserves weren't in place to fix that item. All right, the next tip I have for you is that the rules and regulations of an HOA are not only legally bound, but they vary and they can change. So they vary amongst each individual complex. They're legally bound to every person that lives inside of that complex or inside of that HOA. And if they want, just like the HOA fees, they can change the rules on a dime. If they decide they don't want dogs inside of the neighborhood, they can eliminate that if they want. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but the next thing I wanted to mention about HOA communities is that they can be any type of property you can think of. Single family homes can be in an HOA, gated communities, condos, heck, even mobile home parks can be, luxury, just everything you can think of can be enveloped in an HOA. There is no real rule on this. So if for any reason you're thinking, well, I'm just going to look at this type of property or in this certain city because there's not going to be an HOA, that might not necessarily be the case. While you're home shopping, if you're already at the point where you're talking to a real estate professional, they should be letting you know what's in an HOA and what's not. In fact, they can generally send you searches that are just in HOAs or just not in HOAs, depending on what you're wanting. Of course, if you're doing all of your research early, as a lot of buyers are whenever they're like a year and a half or more than 6 months out, most home buyers or shoppers in general are doing everything online. Just look for it on there if an HOA is or is not your thing. Just make sure you're checking all that stuff out. And then when you get to a point to get a little bit closer, just make sure you're asking that question because you might not be seeing all of the fees and everything that you need to know on the site. One great example of this here in our area is we have a couple of different cities here that have multiple HOAs. Most of the time, the real estate agents, when they put it into the multiple listing service, which is what gets syndicated out to the Trulia and Realtor.com and Zillow and all those all the websites in the world, it throws them out to there. They'll just put the HOA fees on there and they won't put the county fees. They won't put, if it's on Holiday Isle, that they have their own kind of leasing fee. They won't put that stuff on there. Most of them do, but not always. So just make sure that you're asking those questions before you fall too much in love with one property. All right, moving right along, the next thing I want to bring up when buying in an HOA community is that you might have a problem with the HOA developer, HOA manager, or whoever is controlling the HOA in general. So as I mentioned in another video before, there is one big example I always use out here, and there's a lot of different examples of this, but one that we use in particular is a big condo complex that had this beautiful pool. I mean, gorgeous palm trees and all this great stuff, and several restaurants on site and a bar on site, a couple of them actually, and just a lot of great amenities. And the developer wanted control, and he basically wanted to keep making money after he built and sold all these condo complexes or all these condo buildings, because it's several buildings in one complex. And through the thing in litigation, or the owners kind of uproared and ended up going into litigation, fighting back with the developer, caused litigation. And when litigation happens on a condo complex, the prices drop dramatically because everybody's worried what's going to happen. And then not only that, but the pool started becoming disarray. One of the restaurants went out of business. Like, just a bunch of stuff happened that was not good. They eventually ended up winning and everybody's happy now. But in the meantime, that shot prices down pretty hard. So this is something you need to know before buying in an HOA community, that something like this could happen. Although it's very, 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 very rare. Another thing to note when buying in an HOA community is generally, and probably the bulk majority of them, let's say 80% of them, you're going to have a little bit better of a community, a feel of community rather. So just overall, just being more friendly with your neighbors. I'm not saying that buying in an HOA community makes you a nicer person. In fact, sometimes I think it brings out the Karen or the Kyle or whatever they're saying nowadays with, making fun of that person. Not trying to make fun of any Karens or Kyles out there, but it brings out that kind of side in some people, but in other people, it's going to give you a greater sense of community in general. You're going to know your neighbors a little bit more, particularly if you're living in like a condo complex. For instance, one of the condo complexes I lived in was beautiful, right on the water, loved it. I just got to know people around me. In fact, I was very lucky. I was in, how it was built was basically 4 condos to a building. And there was, I don't know, 20, 30 buildings on the property. And my entire fourplex was empty for most of the time I lived there, just out of pure randomness. But I got to know some of the other people there. In fact, got to know a lot of them very, very, very well. And so it was very kind of nice. It was kind of nice. I would go home. I'd recognize somebody I saw. They'd be walking their dog. My dog got to know their dog. It was fun. We'd drink beers out at the, looking over the water into Destin. Like, it was just pretty cool there. But in a lot of HOAs, it might be a pretty big downfall. Maybe you don't want to talk to your neighbors. In that case, don't pick a tight-knit neighborhood like that. Another note about HOA communities is kind of a good sign of it. And mind you, some of these things that I'm throwing out were on a previous video, so if you haven't watched that video, we're going to throw it in like right here, so that you right here, I don't know which side of the screen it goes on, but the little gray box should pop up in one of the corners that you can watch out for the pros and cons. But typically in an HOA neighborhood, you're going to uphold your value a little bit better, and this is a pretty big deal for a lot of people, so just keep that in mind. On average, HOA communities sell about 4% more than non-HOA communities. Now at the end of the day, this is kind of a wash, because that also means you're paying 4% more. Now, that's just a few of the things that I think everybody should know before buying in an HOA community here in Florida. If you have any experience with HOAs at all, put it down below in the comment section. I would absolutely love to hear your story. And don't forget to smash that like button. It really helps us out with the algorithm. And we'll see you next week. See ya.